Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in this episode?
In this episode, we are sitting down with an old friend and fellow social studies teacher to discuss the Equal Rights Amendment.
All right.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
Episode 12, the Equal Rights Amendment. Brooke and I are joined by my friend and history teacher, Mary Bezbatchenko, who wrote her thesis on the Equal Rights Amendment. Mary, it's so nice to have you here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, yes. Thank you so much for taking some time on a Sunday night to hang with us.
No problem. I'm excited. I'm a fan of your guys's, so I'm excited.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, so full story, Kelsie won't stop talking about you and her friend Mary, and so we've been talking about having you on the pod for a while, and I'm so excited you're here. But I need the full story. How did you guys meet? How are you and Kelsie friends?
Well, Kelsie and I met. We both were teachers with students who got selected to do the National History Day. What is it? The Normandy Institute.
God,
what was it?
Albert H. Small Normandy Institute.
Yeah, it had a long name. And what was 2014? 2015?
2016, I think.
Okay, I was going to say. I couldn't remember exactly, but it's
been
been
a while ago.
It's been a while since we
have
seen each other, too. But we had students who got selected to do this, and it was a National History Day program where you picked a soldier from your home state who was killed in the Normandy campaign. And so we spent a whole year like researching the student's or the soldier's life and learning about D-Day, and then did a week at University of Maryland, kind of more in-depth research. And Kelsie and I were roommates. So we shared a
That's so fun. So Mary, what state do you teach in currently?
So I am from Ohio. So I'm kind of in Columbus, Ohio, so right in the center, kind of a suburb area outside the city.
So is it a big school, small school? Tell us a little bit about.
It is a growing school is what I would say. It's one of the fastest growing districts in central Ohio. So we have a pretty large school. We have about, I want to say 1,300 kids at the high school.
And so you're a history teacher.
Cool. I am in the social studies department. I teach a college credit, American history, and then AP government.
And so what was the soldier that you guys picked to get you into this project?
Mm-hmm. His name was William Barton, and unfortunately we didn't find, there really wasn't that much information about our guy too much, which the reason why my student who I went with, he picked him, and he specifically wanted to pick a private because he said, I want to pick somebody that's just an average person, like that you normally wouldn't learn anything about. So he picked like an average person.
Your student was so awesome. I just love like the mindset there is so cool.
Yes, exactly. It's so Spencer. But yeah, so he just kind of picked an average, guy. And so we didn't end up finding tons specifically on him. But there was a sad story for him, is that the one that the one personal story we could find about him. So he was killed not on actual D-Day. He was killed. So after they, of course, took the beaches, then they had to make their way to Paris. And that took like a little over a month or so, I think, to like push through and make it to kind of actually make the break for Paris. So he was killed in one of the battles kind of after they took the beaches. And I think he was like his first day in combat, and he was killed. So he was killed on July 4th. But it took some time to they sent home the information to his parents. And the one story we found about him is they didn't share it with his mom because his mom was dying. And they didn't want her to know that her son had been killed while she herself was kind of on her way out.
Wow.
So she died like 2 weeks later or something. So, and he was an only child too. So then I feel, tough for his dad. Not only did he lose his son, but also his wife kind of in the span of a month. So
wow.
It's a sad story there, but
our guy, we researched Kenneth Day from New Hampshire, and he similarly had he also survived D-Day itself, made it, and I think he died June 14th, so in a battle further inland. But he similarly had kind of a sad family story. And I think on a women's history podcast, your story about his mom dying back home is kind of cool. And our guy he was injured in Italy actually, and was back in Britain, like recovering before D-Day happened. And he sent his mom a letter saying like, I think I'm coming home, like see you soon. And come to find out he's being shipped to Normandy, and his parents end up splitting after D-Day, because they couldn't cope with their son's death.
That actually is like a really high statistic of people who lose a child. It's like, there's, I don't know what the number, but it's very high that they usually divorce because
break up. Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, that was a really amazing experience.
Well, it's kind of been, I mean, that was so amazing. It really was fascinating. And then initially I've done a couple other things with them, and I feel like it's a little bit of a theme as far as the mom goes. So I ended up doing their World War I trip for teachers. So it was just teachers, which was a little nice, to have the kid aspect, the student aspect there. But
you can have alcohol. Good for you.
But I researched he was a pilot. So it was like early planes in World War I, and he was killed, but his mom ended up being one of the like Gold Star moms that they took groups of Gold Star moms to the cemeteries about a year after the war ended to go visit, their son's grave. And that was one thing they talked a lot about, is about how much the French took care of the Americans' graves. Was like they almost looked at them as like, these are our, like, our boys, because they died here kind of saving us. So they had been taking care of their graves. But there's a great picture that we found of his mom kind of standing by his grave over in Paris or over in France. And I just find it weird, because then it was like, it was a similar pose where you stand next to it and you put she had her hand on the top of the cross of his grave. And then we all took, I have a similar picture of me then, standing there at his grave. And it was that's
bizarre.
Weird, but I was glad. I mean, like just thinking for these moms, what a nice thing that was for them to offer to take them over there for these trips. And they did a series of these trips, because how hard would that be if your child, is buried over somewhere else? So
that would be awful. Also, I guess that's why they went there, is to help. But I don't know. I'd want my son home.
Yeah. Well, I think, what is it, like 40% got shipped home? Is that right? Or something? Yeah. Like that? Yeah. They exhumed a lot of bodies and brought them back.
Yeah. They gave them the choice. Do you want your son to stay there, or do you want to bring him home?
Yeah.
And
that part for me of the whole trip was the hardest part, because knowing how many people were brought back, how many people survived, right? I was not anticipating the number of graves that we saw. And the last day, it kind of hit me, I think similar to you with your standing hand on the grave. It hit me like I couldn't remember if any of the family members we interviewed had actually come to France to see. And so it hit me that my student and I were the first people to come to see his grave specifically. And that, I don't know, it felt like we were leaving a family member at the time, even though I never clearly met this person.
No, but I agree. Close to your research, I'm sure. Similarly to the story you were just telling, Mary, it's like, it sounds like you really get invested when you're digging into these people's pasts and their families. And it's not a story that, isn't close to home. Like, you can really put yourself in their shoes to think about this happening and how you would feel. Which is the cool part about being history teachers, I think, for the both of you, is you can very much tell those narratives that can get kids excited, because it's easier for them to put themselves there the more detail you guys provide.
Oh, yeah.
Really cool. And the fact that you get to go. I mean,
being the places where they were was like really cool. I mean, just
so real. That's wild.
And I will say, I am not a huge war history person, and I always have to like preface that to like my students because when they get to like Civil War, whatever, they like want to you always have kids that like want to talk battles and strategy, and I'm like, oh, I just don't. That's just not my thing. I just don't
consider your thing, Mary, as a teacher.
I like social history. So like social movements are kind of what I find most interesting.
Talking about today.
Yeah, exactly. So interesting. So yeah, it's like or even for wars, I don't mind like learning like the build up to it and the effects of it, but the actual war itself, I've never really been super interested in. But through like the programs, like the history programs, what I found is when I can make a personal connection like that, and learn stories about the people who were fighting, then those, even like the battles seem more interesting to me.
So I feel like World War II is a really great but odd transition into the ERA. So we'll make it though, because I feel like World War II, in terms of social history, transforms American society because you're taking a whole bunch of men, you're shipping them off to war, as well as women who are involved as WACs, as Rosies, as all sorts of things back home. And then the war is over. Everybody comes back. People say, go back to your normal gender norms. Mm-hmm. And moms, Gold Star moms, are empowered to be like, wait a second, like, I just lost my son. Like, I'm not going back to normal. Women are like, I'm not giving up my job. And some of them are giving up their job because they feel like it's their patriotic duty to give it to a soldier. But other people are like, getting a paycheck was kind of nice.
Yeah, a lot of them need independence now. Their spouse may not be coming back. So it's like, no, I can't give my job up. I'm the breadwinner now.
Right. So I think it's not surprising that following World War II, we have civil rights movement, women's rights movement, and all these groups saying we're not going back to the pre-war world.
Yeah. Well, and I even think it's like they came back, and I think there was that, like the brief period I always talked about to the kids about the 1950s. It's like when people look back, it looks so great. Oh, the 1950s was so great. But for a lot of people, so I think there was a time where everybody was like, oh, let's kind of shoehorn ourselves back into more of the norm. And then people quickly realize, I don't like the norm anymore. Like, I'm not okay with the norm anymore. Let's change this. So yeah, I think you get kind of a period in the early 50s where it's like everybody tries to conform and then it just explodes from there.
Yeah.
Like once you it's like, what's that, snake in a can? You can't put it back in.
Can't put it back.
Toothpaste in a bottle.
It's out.
What are the good metaphors? I know none.
Those were all good. I think
good. Yeah.
Okay. But before we get to the ERA, we want to ask you kind of the topical question that we ask everybody, which is, why are women left out of history class? And you're a history teacher. I'm a history teacher. I know that I leave women out all the time. So why do we leave women out of history?
I think there's a variety of ways you could go with it. So there's so many different things that come together to end up with the left out. I think to begin with is the fact that for a long time, like just historians in general were men, and they focused in on what they're interested in, or they focused from the point of view of, because I don't think even like social history was, for a long time, it wasn't really looked into. And of course, that's where women's roles were the largest for a long time, was more in the social realm. And that wasn't considered to be as important history, I guess, as wars and politics and, things that women were kept out of. So if you're kept out of the place that people are considering to be the most important thing, you're not going to be showing up in the history books about it. And then just even from the perspective of there just wasn't as many like female historians then writing history. So if you are writing about what you know and what you're interested in, you're going to get guys writing about guys probably, and women writing about women. So if there's not a lot of women writing, or at least, or even just maybe they weren't being published, because that could be the thing too, is they just weren't being published out there too. So that's going to be limiting. One of the things that my a fellow teacher who teaches, I'm actually taking on the women's history class this year. I kind of brought it to attention to the school. And then when they started it, I didn't have room in my schedule for it. And I was so bummed, but I'm taking it on next semester. So it'll be a semester class, but this one teacher had started it, teaching it. And she has the kids look at the state standards for all the classes: world history, American history, government. She looks at all the social studies standards, and they have to find all the women's standards. And there's like one per class.
Like, mention women, move on.
Yeah. It's like, women worked in factories during World War II. Women's movement in the 1970s. And it's like, that's about it.
Yeah.
And so I think it gives...
I'd be so curious, like some of the kids' reactions after doing that self-discovery.
Yeah.
Like, I bet, like, what?
Yeah, and I think they are. So she told me that, so I'm going to start my class the same way.
Love it.
And I think, whereas like your guys' podcast is saying, like, there's ways that you can bring women into these stories, but I think if they're not specifically listed in a standard, that also a lot of teachers are like, well, then I don't have to do it.
Right.
It's not in there, so I don't actually have to do it. And then I was talking to my sister-in-law one time. I think I was actually telling her guys about your podcast to go listen to it.
Yeah.
And I was saying that one of the hard things is there's not a lot of resources out there for teachers about how to incorporate women's story into history. Whereas, you can find lots of like lessons online or books at the store about, all sorts of things like D-Day or, a story on the founding fathers. It's like you can find these, and a lot of teachers, it's like they don't have time to go out there and research and find information to then pull into their class, that if it's out there and readily available and somebody else has already created it, it's more likely a teacher will incorporate it into the classroom versus a teacher having to create it all on their own.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times, teachers don't have time or they don't know where to look sometimes for things.
Well,
and so
a lot of there's tons of women historians that are out there right now, and they're publishing all sorts of amazing things about women. But in a history class with kids with ADHD or English language learners or whatever, like I can't be like, go read this book on women's history.
Yes.
Like that's not how it works. So you need to have those sort of like packaged lessons like you're talking about.
Exactly. And I was saying that I was telling her, I was like, if you could do, and that goes for so many other groups too, it's like, whether it be African Americans or Hispanic Americans, it's just,
I also think educating your students on the state standards also educates them on how to be a community member to stand up against those standards. So that's some of the things that like Kelsie and I talk about, is how we can impact change. And so it's not only highlighting, and Kelsie does an amazing job on the website of all these great resources for teachers, but it's then highlighting this for people to understand you don't have to just accept this. You can actually go to your community and make some change so that history books, as our kids get older, are inclusive of all culture and don't just tell one white American narrative. So, that would be ideal. And I think what you guys are doing with that class is awesome. Yeah. That you're showing them this is actually how we make the choices of what you get to have in your education.
What a cool idea your colleague had. I love that way to start the class. Well, and also like talking about the ERA specifically, it kind of strikes me that a topic like the ERA and most of like kind of major events in women's rights and women's history happened in the latter part of a U.S. history class, which is about the time of year when I'm like throwing history at students as fast as humanly possible. So I feel like it's also hard just because of how we structure a course. Like I would love to teach a class that's like post World War II.
Yes.
Forward, and it's still history. And then I also think it's hard because like the ERA conflicts with civil rights movement. Like you got to teach that. You got to teach about Vietnam. Sorry, like I know you hate war, but like right. And so you
can't ignore. I mean, those are all major things going on too.
Yeah. How much time do you spend on an amendment that didn't even get ratified?
Right. Exactly.
Didn't pass. Yeah. That's true.
Well, think about another one that you would even bring up.
Yeah.
Well, none that would have gotten that far. I mean, like there was an attempted child labor amendment, but it didn't make it. Like this one came so close that like none of the other ones I think that got proposed have ever made it like that close. I don't think so.
Yeah. And to have such a contentious public battle over it.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we've wet everybody's palate here. You know, like they're ready to go. So this is a great time to take a break and we'll be right back.
Oh, breaks.
For lesson plan ideas and how to teach women's history, visit our website, www.remedialherstory.com. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Remedial Herstory. If you think what we're doing is needed, please consider joining our Patreon community. Patreon allows you to sponsor a podcast with a small donation. Patrons get access to bonus materials, extended episodes, insider information, and gear. Patrons who give at the $10 tier will receive a Remedial Herstory sticker. We want to sincerely thank some of our patrons for their contributions. Kent and Jamie Heckle from Ohio have been some of our biggest fans from the beginning. Thank you so much for your contribution. And a huge thank you to Bridget Erlandson from Connecticut. As an educator, your endorsement and passion for equitable education means a great deal. Thank you for your support and endorsement. You can find a link to our Patreon page on our website, www.remedialherstory.com, or you can go to patreon.com and search for Remedial Herstory. Welcome back, everybody. We are here with my friend Mary talking about the Equal Rights Amendment. And in my class, by the time I get to the Equal Rights Amendment, I'm flying through history like a wild woman. It gets passing mention, but the more I think about it, I feel like that's wrong. And so that's basically why you're here, is to fix how I teach history.
Oh, no, Mary, this task.
My shoulders, I feel like.
Okay, everyone, listen up. Mary's going to fix it all.
The ERA, I feel like, is probably one of the most substantive political battles impacting women's history after women's suffrage. So the fact that it doesn't get decent airtime in my classroom is pretty problematic, and it's kind of the typical prioritization of war and, you know, male-centric top-down history. So what I did know about the ERA, or rather what textbooks taught me about the ERA, is that it coincided with a rise in conservatism after the 1960s. And voices like Phyllis Schlafly, who many people might know because she was the main character in the Hulu series Mrs. America that came out this year. In the show, Schlafly and her gaggle of housewives take on big names in feminist politics like Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, Shirley Chisholm, and it gives you an inside look at the lives that these women had and the movements in the battle to get the amendment ratified. So, Mary, I figure a lot of our listeners have probably seen this show and maybe at this point know the name Phyllis Schlafly, probably Gloria Steinem, some of those other names I just listed.
I mean, Shirley Chisholm, anyone listening should read more about her. Like, badass.
She's a boss.
Definitely, yes.
So could you start by telling everybody how accurate you found that show to be?
I loved it, first of all. I thought it was a great show. So many heavy hitters in it. So I think as far as like ideas go in the presentation of the arguments for and against it, to me all rang, very true. You definitely see kind of the main, the reasons why people felt that the amendment was necessary, the arguments against it. From what I have read, when kind of historians, when they came out, when the show came out, and also I think Gloria Steinem came out and made some comments about the show, that as far as I think some of the like personal aspects of it, arguments between women and some of the more like, behind the scenes look, they were saying didn't quite ring true. As far as like, I think it set up some like, it caused, they create some tension or conflict where maybe it got blown up for the series or so some of the, like the personal
made it more dramatic.
I think so. Yes. Surprise. So I think that kind of got blown up a little bit. And then I did see some criticism among historians about that too much credit was given to Phyllis Schlafly for defeating the ERA.
Okay.
That really, she was definitely a big, a big name and gained a lot of media attention around her and the movement that she did create, the Stop ERA movement. But the criticism was that really it wasn't, how do I say this? That they didn't necessarily change any opinions to vote no on it. What they did is they gave some men who were unsure about it the permission to vote no for it. Mm-hmm. So whereas like you would have some like male legislators who don't want to vote for it. They don't like the ERA. They don't like, because as you kind of said, they're heading toward, we're moving towards a little more conservative era by the time the ERA kind of got sent to the states, that they were kind of just, they wanted political cover kind of to be able to say no to it. And by having women against it, gave them the political cover to feel more comfortable with saying no for it.
Yeah. And it was interesting because in the show, I thought, because I didn't know a lot of the names of the other people that were brought in. And I know some of them are fictional, but she has, some anti-abortion people who join her group. She's got people from various states. She's got a Southern coalition of women that are,
white
supremacists or anti-segregation or desegregation or whatever.
Let's call them what they are.
Yeah. White supremacists. So it seemed like there was this, diverse group of people, but it's interesting that you say that historians were against that because, or sort of thought that they gave her too much credit, because literally the textbook that I have, it's like Phyllis Schlafly single-handedly defeated the ERA. Like it was said.
I actually went and checked a prominent kind of women's history book, and it said the same thing. So I was kind of surprised too. But yeah, there was definitely some historians who came out and said this is, she was important and clearly was key, because maybe without her that people would have felt that they had to vote for it. Like public opinion polls showed support of the ERA. So the thing is, like, maybe if that movement hadn't started, more politicians would have felt that they had to vote in favor of it. So you at least have to give her credit. I mean, she was out there with like the media, and she got a lot of media attention, and she was able to organize.
That they played in the show, her ability to get people involved and passionate. I mean, very interesting that she had as much power as she did, but also just the way that she was able to kind of grow an army, if you will, of other women that felt the same enough to make it, build this cohort of people that, would bring that forward.
And that's what I found when I was researching the ERA. I specifically, my thesis was on the ERA in Virginia, but I looked at, clearly the larger picture as well. And that was one of the things that historians have said about the ERA and its failure, was that by the time it actually did pass Congress with big majority. And so that led to the proponents maybe feeling a sense of false security that, oh, this was easy. This is going to pass. Like, this is a no-brainer. States are going to pass this. It's going to become part of the Constitution. And by proponents kind of thinking it was going to be easy, they didn't organize but the opposition organized, including Phyllis and other groups. And the way that the amendment process works in our country, the harder job is the people who want the change, because you have to get 38 out of 50 states. Whereas if I'm somebody who's opposed, I only have to stop 13. But yeah, so like if you want to stop change, you have the easier job. You only have to get 13 states to say no. And so if you have really strong opposition and an organized opposition, like Phyllis was able to do, you do have a better chance of preventing the change from happening. So you have to give it in that she was able to organize, and she had a strong kind of network of mailing lists. She had already kind of started kind of organizing for her other policies that she was working on and her other causes. So she already had
a really strong email address.
Yes.
First started capturing emails. It's like, oh, how many emails?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're sending out the blast.
That was interesting part of the show, because in history, she's the woman who stopped the ERA. And in the show, they talk about, her passion for international politics, and she's an expert in missiles and things like that. Yeah. I'm like, wow, like I had no idea any. Like, it's funny how history pigeonholes people. You are known for this.
Yeah, well, if you dig into her, she's fascinating. I mean, whether you love her or hate her, you have to admit that she was a really fascinating person. So many complexity, because she was very that's how she got her career started, was foreign policy. And then she kind of wound up, she attempted a couple runs, for positions.
Yeah, it makes it's kind of surprising that she took the position on the ERA that she did as a woman who kind of broke some barriers in her time, to be a female within politics to help with missiles.
Yeah,
the only seat at the table at the moment. Could you put another chair next to you? It's kind of interesting that she came back and was like, yeah, no women are allowed in my space either.
Yeah. Well, and it's something that the pro ERA people would bring up against her quite often, of well, you're out there, you're traveling around to all these states, you're giving all these speeches in front of state legislators, you're away from home and all your kids. And they would oftentimes try to kind of use that against her. And she would oftentimes just come back with, well, I asked my husband if I could do this. And that was always kind of her out, is well, I got permission from my husband to be here today. And she actually liked to start a lot of her speeches that way, so.
Oh, man.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the arguments for and against the ERA? Just what do you tell your students? Because I'm only familiar one or two on each side. So
yeah. So the proponents for the ERA, so particularly coming out, well, the ERA was proposed right after women gained the right to vote. So they got the right to vote, 19th Amendment. The first ERA was proposed in 1923 by Alice Paul, who was a big woman to fight for the suffrage. So she proposed it. And then it proceeded to die in Congress for years and years and years and years, until really then kind of gaining steam from in the 1960s, when you have all the social movements going on. So you have kind of a country that's primed, for change, or is experiencing a lot of change. And then with the women's movement kind of growing, it helped lead to kind of it getting off the ground again in Congress. And some of the arguments in favor of it, why this needed to be passed, was, well, look at all of the laws that exist that discriminate towards women. So we, right now, at least it was felt in the 1960s, 1970s, that there was no guaranteed, no actually specific protection for women in the Constitution other than the 19th Amendment. Mm-hmm. That, yes, you have the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, but the Equal Protection Clause, if you're looking at the legislative intent, so some of the arguments are, if when people look at the legislative intent, which is why was it included, it wasn't really included for women. The Equal Protection Clause was included for African Americans, former slaves. So if you're going to look at that, it never really was intended for women. So people could use that against it of saying, well, we don't, these doesn't really apply to these laws. But even if you look at it and you say, okay, if you're going to look at it and say it does include women, if the 14th Amendment really did protect women, why would we have needed the 19th Amendment? Because it should have protected our right to vote if we were equal. We wouldn't have needed the Equal Pay Act. We wouldn't have needed all these other laws that in the 1960s, 1970s were now being challenged in court. Then you had, even when they were challenging in court, they were taking cases about women discrimination to court. And the court did start striking down some of these laws, but the court still did not hold sex or to discrimination based on sex to that high standard that they were holding race to. That, like, if you're in my government class, we talk about like the rational basis test for the strict scrutiny test, and race gets held to kind of the highest standard when it came to the courts of, like, if you have a law that discriminates based on race, you have to have like the best reason that you're discriminating based on race, and pretty much nothing meets that standard. So almost nothing that discriminates based on race gets upheld. But they never held women or sex discrimination to that same standard. So that was like actually one of the things like Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked on. She wanted the court to make sex discrimination that strict standard, but the court said no. They made it this like intermediate standard. So some of the arguments for the Equal Rights Amendment would be, if you had this in the Constitution, then you'd have to hold sex discrimination up to that high standard.
Right.
So that was kind of the argument for it. The argument against it, well, they would say, some of the opponents would say, well, we have the 14th Amendment. So an Equal Rights Amendment would really just be redundant, that you don't really need it. We just need to better enforce the 14th Amendment. Like, it's already on the books. We don't need to add something new.
Yeah, like it's understanding how the legislation should be, interpreted.
Yeah, just you got to enforce it better. What they did, some of the Stop ERA arguments that they would use were more social arguments against it. That it was going to take, and that's the stop taking our privileges was kind of what it stood for. They said it would cause women to lose kind of their privileges of being women. Some silly stuff, I would say, like men aren't going to hold doors open for women anymore. Men won't let women walk through the door first. It's kind of silly, but like cultural things. But to a lot of people that, I guess those things matter. This idea of like women won't be on this pedestal anymore. But then even to things like, it's going to lead to unisex bathrooms because you can't have separate bathrooms because that would violate the Equal Rights Amendment. Mm-hmm. You couldn't be a housewife anymore because if the Equal Rights Amendment passes, you are going to, a female would have to provide 50% to household income. So therefore she would have to go out and get a job and couldn't stay at home.
Not that the work that she's doing in the home would be reimbursed for 50%.
Yes, exactly.
Don't do that kind of math.
Don't do that. No. And but the other side, the proponents would say, like kind of what you said is no, because you could look at it as what she's contributing in the house is 50%, but it was something that got brought up a lot, and they would use that argument when they would go out and meet with housewives. They're like, well, you're going to have to go to work because you're going to have to provide 50% of the household income. They argued that in
narrative, right? Like that wasn't actually part of the
no.
Yeah, okay.
And that's the thing is, a lot of the opponents' arguments, when they were challenged, like by lawyers, constitutional lawyers, family lawyers, because some of their arguments were, men wouldn't have to pay alimony anymore. Women would have less chance of getting their children in divorce for child custody. Lawyers and stuff would come out and say, like, none of that stuff's really going to happen. Like those aren't actually going to happen. Women aren't going to be forced out of the home. Women aren't going to, but that doesn't hold people's attention as much as oh my gosh, I'm going to be forced out of my home, you know? And then, yes, the draft issue was big. Because remember, we're also in Vietnam. We're also in that time frame. So people are having to deal with the draft. And so one of the arguments was women would have, if you're going to treat them equally, women would have to be drafted. And the proponents, the people who were ERA supporters, they conceded. They're like, well, yeah, but that's okay because women should contribute, you know, and go fight for their country too, just like men would have to do. Like that would be okay. But that's still like women in combat. I mean, women in combat even today is a, you know,
yeah,
some people have a hard time with that. And I mean, that didn't happen until, God, it was like the 2000s. At some point, did they officially declare women could be in combat? Yeah. So imagine it, you know, in 1970.
My students regularly point this out. Like, why would women, and it's typically my male students, they point out, like, why would women want to be drafted? And it's hard. I mean, especially like Brooke and I are mothers to sons, you know? So like, part of me is like, why do you want boys to be drafted? Like, I don't want everybody to be drafted.
Drafts aren't cool, guys. Drafts aren't cool. But
like, this is about like, but I don't know. Like, I don't.
But there are other countries, which you guys probably know more than I would, that they do draft daughters and sons.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
There is a televised debate where Schlafly sits down with lawyers, Mark and Brenda Fegan Fast.
They didn't come up in my research, but I came up in the book, like when the show was on, and so. They were both
that debate would be a really cool thing. You can watch it, and I think that would be a really cool thing to show students. Have them watch the debate. I don't know.
Yeah. And it's kind of like if you something that students could probably understand a little bit compared to modern, like what's going on with politics right now, is if you think about a lot of times the proponents, the supporters of the ERA were bringing up very substantive reasons why they felt it was needed and bringing it back to like the Constitution and very kind of concrete things that they felt the ERA would do. But that's all very law, it's very, sometimes can be dense and, like not everybody understands kind of like lawyer speak. And the opponents were bringing it to more of a base level, like
you want your daughters drafted. You
don't want to hear bathroom, like putting out kind of like more common people thing. And it's kind of like if you think, and it got a lot of attention. So it's kind of like if you look at like elections nowadays, there's a lot of talk about in the build up to election, the media doesn't cover policy as much as it does like what somebody was wearing or like one soundbite, so it's kind of similar to that and that frustrated a lot of the proponents because they're like, we are trying to make real arguments. And so like in that debate in the show, like the lawyers are like, we're trying to make real arguments here. And you're coming back with some kind of like cliche comment. And that might be the soundbite that got played on the news, So I think was very tricky for the supporters of the ERA to find a way to fight. It's hard to fight those kind of like folksy elements.
Yeah, like if you're bringing reason to the table and someone else is bringing fire and knives, you're like,
I feel like we just all watched that a couple.
Yeah, exactly.
With the presidential debate, I don't know, just throwing it out there.
Maybe a similar situation. One of the things, and this would be interesting, again, if you think of it coming on the heels of the civil rights movement, kind of the underlying, not always, and sometimes they would state it out loud, but I think it was kind of an undercurrent because a lot of the states that did not ratify the ERA were Southern states. And some of the arguments were made was this is another power grab by the federal government. Only because the second part of the amendment is Congress will enforce this amendment or, will enact it. And so they say, well, look, the federal government's grabbing more power. This is going to take power away from the states. So somewhat they were making a states' rights argument, like this is yet another amendment that's going to take power away from the states. And they would say it, but of course not say, if you think about, okay, they're just coming off of the heels of what a lot of southern states were mad about is the federal government's forcing us to desegregate. The federal government's forcing us to,
Yeah, so there's a lot of Big Brother coming in and telling us how we're going to run our culture. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so that kind of was an undercurrent, I think, through a lot of the southern states' arguments against the ERA as well. So
we feel for the South, but could you just get in line sometimes?
In the early years in Virginia, it seemed like their strategy was like, oh, well, we just need to educate people why the ERA is needed. If we just educate them, they'll clearly get on our side because, it just makes sense. And they found, again, that reason isn't the best argument all the time. People don't respond always to just kind of rational reasons. Mm-hmm. And so they learned quickly on just trying to educate the legislators, the all-male legislators at the time, about the need for the ERA, and just to educate the public wasn't cutting it, wasn't doing enough. And so about halfway through the fight, that's when they switched to more legislative politics of, okay, well, if these people in the legislature aren't listening, we've got to get new people in the legislature. And so they switched to kind of trying to find candidates who would support the ERA, trying to donate money, raise money for those candidates, campaign for those candidates. But all of that takes much longer, right, and it's harder because you got to get those people known. And, whereas incumbents usually win, once you're in office, you tend to stay in office. And so it's hard to get challengers against those people. So they started to have some success for that. They started to get some people elected, but their time ran out, they weren't able to kind of make that transition fast enough to make it really, effective. Plus the committee system in Virginia, they had a unique committee system where everything had to go through this one committee, who were led by conservatives. So for most of the time, Virginia just flat out were it's just going to sit here in committee. It's going to die in committee every year. We're not even going to bring it to the floor for debate or discussion. It was kind of fighting this one powerful committee in Virginia. So that was interesting.
So just this year, though, the state of Virginia passed the ERA.
That was so exciting. I was
they're the 38th. So they're the 38th state to pass it, but it means nothing because the ERA ran out of its timeline, right? It had a certain amount of time that they had to get it passed, get it ratified.
There's a debate about this, actually. Because it's kind of working its way through two systems right now. It is being challenged in court to say, yes, it counts. We got our 38 states. It counts. It should be part of the Constitution. And then they're also working on, just trying to possibly get it proposed and start the process over again. But the argument is...
This might be a dumb question, but does that mean that every state has to vote on it again?
Yes.
If they do the second one.
What is the timeline that they had to get it done?
Well, so, and that's the part that's being challenged in court, because in the Constitution doesn't say anything about putting a time limit. When the Constitution talks about the amendment process, there's nothing mentioned about a time limit. In fact, the 27th Amendment was proposed in the original Bill of Rights, I believe, in the 1700s, and it didn't get approved until the 1990s.
What? 15 years went by. Turns out you guys to start over.
Yeah.
So that one. So again, that happened. It sat there, so the argument is the timeline that was attached by Congress to the ERA, and other amendments apparently, in the more modern era, have had time limits placed on them.
What do we know why?
I don't know I guess they figure if they're not ratified in X amount of time,
they don't have to talk about it anymore.
Well, honestly, the Stop ERA movement was able to kind of sneak in and mobilize when they weren't expecting it. So I wonder if it's to sort of stop that kind of people think it's dead, so they're not ready to fight it, kind of thing.
Yeah. So for whatever reason, they added these time limits. And so the argument is that wasn't, basically the time limit was unconstitutional. That the time limit shouldn't matter because that's not actually part of the amendment process.
No.
So the time limit itself was unconstitutional. So therefore it could still be part of the Constitution now that there are 38 states who ratified it. So that's an interesting, like, something to watch because it's
get it done.
Yeah, what makes the new Supreme Court nominee a very important person, knowing that amendments like that are going to be coming up.
Yeah.
We can't talk about our girl Amy right now.
Yeah.
So much drama.
So much drama there.
Oh, Phyllis and Amy.
Mm-hmm.
I felt really stupid watching that show because I teach history and I'd never heard of this conference. I had never heard of the Spirit of Houston and the document that was produced. And granted, like, I wasn't alive. So
how dare you?
But at the same time, like, this is a major moment in 50% of the population's lives. And I have no idea that this exists. And, so that's an embarrassing moment, number one, for me. But it made me think, I recently learned that Seneca Falls, in retrospect, has kind of been blown up as this big moment in history. But like at the time, it wasn't perceived that way. Do you think that the Spirit of Houston, this document with all the things that they want Carter to address, do you think that in its time it was as big as the show made it out to be? Or do you think that it was similar to Seneca Falls, where it was kind of like
a blip?
I think it was big to the people who were involved in it. Like, I think for women who were actively involved in the women's movement, it probably seemed at the time like it was going to be big, and they really held like hope. That, like, like this is our moment. We're going to create this document of what needs to be fixed. And maybe, there was some, this is going to happen.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's kind of like most Americans are just really not engaged in politics, so to the people
say that's not true.
If you think about this in 1977, the same was probably true. People in general probably were not following it if they didn't, if they didn't have active.
Yeah, like it's not like social media back then, or there's maybe 5 or 6 national papers at the time, and then the rest were local. And unless you lived in Houston, probably wasn't covered.
Or it was like a little blurb, here, and probably just got, a brief mention on the national news, because they're not going to fill an entire, they didn't have cable news networks.
Yeah.
Like we have cable news networks. So they're not going to spend the entire hour of the news talking about Houston.
Isn't that the plight of the history teacher, is getting citizens walking out of that classroom who are going to engage in politics and local government?
Mary, thank you so much. That was incredibly enlightening. I feel like I learned a lot about the ERA that I didn't really grasp. And it's really interesting just to hear you talk about the different styles of debate and of argument that they're making, because we want our students to be kind of intellectual and to be able to listen to those heady arguments and really understand what's being said. But
there's a lot there. Like I was sitting here, obviously not a history teacher. I'm like, man, there is a lot to this story, but it would be a great way to teach students around legislature and how things, like, instead of watching, what's that, the cartoon show?
Yeah.
The bill on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
Like, all right, I learned nothing from that other than there's a catchy tune and a little bill shaped.
But I also feel like it says a lot about rhetoric, right?
Big time. Like what does that matter?
Because you would think a bill that's titled Equal Rights would be like a no-brainer, but
you're like, move it along.
But then people were like, oh, so everything's equal now, and it's kind of like, well.
So Mary, I have one last question for you.
Yes.
How do we get this in the classroom? So the ERA, where are you putting this in currently?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. So when I teach my government class, so for government teachers out there, I do think, as kind of Kelsie said, this is a great way to look at the legislative process, or maybe Brooke said it. I can't remember. One of you said that, like, this is a great way.
Here we go. Brooke definitely said it, for the record.
There we go. About how do you, like, again, yeah, that you can watch the Schoolhouse Rock, which I do show it. I do highly enjoy the Schoolhouse Rock song. But this is like, I had not reread or read my thesis since I turned it in, back in 2007. So I was like, I'm going to do a quick read of it. And that was before I taught government. So I'm flipping through and I'm like, oh my gosh, they could, like, so many of, like, our vocab words. It's a good example of that, of how, like, the amendment process works. And another kind of standard that I talk about it a lot too is when we talk about, like, just the amendment process. The amendment process is difficult, and it's difficult for a reason. The founding fathers wanted it to be difficult. And, so we kind of bring it in for there as well. And then, yeah, in American history, I always talk about it when we talk about, I kind of try to do a broader week in my American history class on social movements in the 1970s. So we look at women one day, we look at Native Americans kind of social movement in the 1970s another day, and then we look at Hispanic Americans on another day. So we kind of look at it from, we just finished the civil rights movement, now look at all the other ones that kind of came on its heels. So we talk about it as far as part of that bigger social movement that kind of existed in the 1970s, of everybody trying to get more equality and more rights, and more living up to the promise that America, the ideals of America.
Very cool. That's awesome. And so, Kelsie, do we have a lesson plan on the website?
Yeah. So I want to make one using that debate, because I think it speaks to what you're talking about. And I think, history teachers do a really good job of, especially world history teachers, like hero or villain. And Phyllis Schlafly would be a really cool person to address that question with. And get kids to kind of question her. And you could do the same thing for Gloria Steinem, for any of the women that are. So we're going to have a couple resources coming up for teachers on our website.
Awesome. Exciting. And again, kind of going back when we were at the beginning, when we said, if more resources are out there for teachers, the more likely they are to incorporate these topics in their classes. So great.
Oh, Mary, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking me.
Oh my gosh. No, this was great. I love when Kelsie gets a chance to nerd out with other teachers. It's very entertaining.
It is fun.
So thank you for helping in that this evening. But no, this was great.
Glad I could be of assistance.
It was perfect. But I think to do that plug too, the Hulu show is a really great resource, but there's so much out there that you guys have that I think teachers can grab onto and cover a lot of different spaces. The more one piece,
the more recent it is, the better.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I have a couple resources up there already about Shirley Chisholm, because she's a powerhouse. So those are not ones I made, but those are up there as well. Mary, this is amazing. I can't tell you how grateful I am.
Well, thanks for asking me. I appreciate it. This was fun.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.